Congratulations on finishing part one. That's being graded as we speak. Now you're ready for part two. You will get feedback on part one, which will help direct your efforts in part two, but for the time being, it's also useful to know exactly what part two entails. As you know, it consists of 20% group assignment and 20% individual presentation of the group assignment. So you're working in teams, and each person gets approximately 2 minutes to talk about some aspect, some content part of the assignment, and to deliver that in a way that enables us to try to ascertain how much of a contribution and how much understanding you have as an individual to the group assignment. So that's 20% plus another 20%. It consists of a group report, which is a 2-page report, plus those appendices once again. And I'll go into a bit more detail how that report is different from the part one report. And then there's the 10 to 12 minute presentation depending on the size of your group, so that works out to about 2 minutes per person. And finally there is the poster, which is an A2 minimum sized visual representation of your thinking and your tactics and strategy in terms of how you will address those 3 challenges that you concluded part 1 with. So before we do that though, we want to look at the 4 steps in any strategy. I covered this in one of my first lectures to the class, and these 4 steps are something that I came up with in order to summarize the swath of information out there about what you need to do when thinking about strategy or marketing strategy. So the first step is to understand the situation that you're in, and part 1 of your group assignment really is set around having you understand not only the business you've selected, but their sector, their customers, and their competitors, right? So step 1 is essentially done. The first step, you understand the business and the sector, hopefully. Step 2 is to plan. So this is when we start to transition into the SDM, or part 2 of the report, and certainly part 2 of that report or the group assignment will get you to explain your plan to us. The third step is to execute, so you don't really get a chance to do that because you're, unless you happen to be working in the business you've selected as your case client, most of these students, I suspect, won't get a chance to execute, but you can certainly explain how you would recommend they execute certain tactics in order to follow through on your strategic plan. And the fourth step is to evaluate. So once again, if you're not executing, you can't evaluate, but that's a very important step in order to figure out whether your plan has worked or not, whether your strategy has amounted to anything. And in the real world, we would hope that you would evaluate some of your thinking and your tactics to see if you've achieved those objectives. But for the purposes of this group assignment, we only need you to indicate how you might evaluate some of these key deliverables or these KPIs in order to figure out whether your proposed strategy will eventually be effective or not. If we go back to the strategic marketing framework which we developed for the course, I know it's rather hard to see here because it's such a massive framework, so I'll break that down into a little bit more detail in the subsequent slides. But in terms of having an overview, it's helpful to know that part 1 of your assignment covered that top half essentially of the marketing framework, and that was the industry and company analysis. Then part 2, which is your report, your poster, and your presentation, will now look at the second half of that framework. So if we break this down in more detail, we'll notice that the first part of it is essentially about you understanding the situation, whereas the second part will be what to do from here. So the first part looked at these things here. We've got you to decide whether you're thinking about strategy from a corporate perspective or from a product perspective. A lot of the part 1 report was based around an internal analysis of your case company or your case client, as well as a lot of it was to do with the external analysis in terms of macro factors, as well as the market, customers, and competitors. So you've done all of this already in part 1, which hopefully means you have a really good understanding of the situation. Halfway through that marketing framework, we see that we start to take that understanding that you've established in the first half of the project or the first half of this framework, and now we're starting to apply some of that. You cannot really think about value and what it means to your customers or your target market until you understand the situation and the context that your business is operating in. So that's why it's really important, first of all, to understand in order to start planning how you're going to deliver more value to your customers. So this is that second part of the framework. And part two, the SDM, the Strategic Decision Making Report, starts off halfway through this slide here. So we're getting you now to start to think about how you further develop the value proposition of the business, given what you understand about the situation, given what you understand about the customers, and given what you understand about the competitors and the other sort of external factors affecting that business. If we move down that framework, we'll see that a large part of it is about the tactics. So how you're going to implement certain tactics in order to deliver on those grand strategic plans that you've recommended in part two of your group assignment. So this means thinking about how they're going to do something in order to achieve the goals that you suggest that they need to set, these SMART goals, but also how much it's going to cost to deliver some of these tactics. And also very importantly, what type of KPIs or return on investment you expect if they do what you're recommending or suggesting that they do. At this stage, I find it useful to just take a break and go back to one of the earlier lectures I gave on what marketing strategy was anyway. So if you recall, I came up with this definition of marketing strategy. Strategy is the analytical decisions that implement and integrate executable tactics in order to achieve SMART goals under conditions of limited resource and competitive uncertainty. So for those of you that recall, that was the very first lecture I gave in the introduction to marketing strategy. Now, it's always important to keep this in mind when you're finishing part two of the group assignment, because those concepts mentioned in this definition will once again come to the fore when you're looking at delivering part two of the assignment. So another way of looking at that definition is in this diagram here. Competitive uncertainty is the broad framework around which all businesses must operate. Part one of your assignment, you would have looked at some of this competitive uncertainty through your macro analysis, your competitor analysis, opportunities and threats analysis, etc. So you've made some of that uncertainty perhaps a little bit more certain. But because it's business, there will always be a level of uncertainty. And that's okay, because you can never 100% predict what your competitors are going to do or what your consumers are going to do, right? And so you've done as much as you can now. The second thing that you would have done in part one of the assignment was to do that internal analysis, right? The company analysis. So hopefully that alludes to the limited resources that the company may have, whether it be revenue or staffing or maybe even a time frame that they're stuck with. So limited resources are once again a constant in business, particularly in marketing strategy when you've got a limited marketing budget. And so that's another thing that you would have thought about in part one, but you have to continue to consider in part two when you recommend certain actions they must do to address those three challenges that you came up with. And part of that means coming up with these analytical decisions, right? Because if you have limited resources, you have to make decisions. If you had unlimited resources, then you don't have to make any decisions because you can just chuck stuff at it until something works. But because it's business, there's always going to be either limited time and or limited money and or limited effort on the part of your employees, and maybe also limited effort and attention on the part of your consumers, right? So there's all these limited resources that requires you to make these analytical decisions, and that is really what strategy is about. So having considered the situation, the competitive uncertainty, having acknowledged the limited resources, you make these decisions which then lead to those executable tactics, which will take up a large part of part two. Right, so these are the things where you're telling us, the grader, and maybe in some cases the business, if you're working with an actual business, you know, what they should do given the challenges you identified in part one and given the situation that they're in and also the resources they have to work with, right? And so then that will hopefully lead to these SMART goals and objectives. So I've got this example of the famous 50-word limit. So this was a challenge that Dr. Seuss's publisher came up with to challenge Dr. Seuss to write a word using only a selection of 50 words. Right. Imagine writing a book with only 50 words. That's a massive limitation. But that book that he ended up writing was Green Eggs and Ham, which is obviously an international bestseller, an iconic book, right? And he probably wouldn't have come up with a book like that if he had an unlimited number of word choices. So what I want you to, I guess, focus on is that, even though constraints or limits are constant, sometimes it actually helps to enhance creative and strategic thinking. Because when you have limited resources, then the only way you can work with them is to think strategically, is to think creatively. As I mentioned before, if you had unlimited resources, then your thinking can be quite lazy. In fact, you don't really need to do much thinking, because if you have unlimited resources, you can just chuck stuff at it until something works. So look at those limited resources that exist within the business or case company that you've selected, and really try to use those in a form of an advantage in terms of it forcing you to think more creatively and more strategically than you would be thinking had you unlimited resources. So task 1 is to explain and justify the strategic decisions that you've recommended to your client company. So this is essentially the report. So once again, this is a 2-page report. You've done that already in part 1, but that was more about assessing your ability to understand and evaluate a company's situation. Now, for the SDM, or the Strategic Decision Making Report, part 2, we're now assessing your ability to think strategically and creatively in order to maximize the value and return on investment for your client company. And this means working with the limitations you identify, but also within the constraints of the context that they're in, with the customers that you understand that are most valuable to them, and the competitors that are most relevant to them and to your client company and its value proposition. So part 2 is very different from part 1, but obviously it complements part 1, and the feedback you would have received on part 1 will help you develop part 2. So remember that the challenges that we got you to identify at the end of part 1 don't have to be the same for part 2, because you might have received feedback from us that one of your challenges is not quite right, or you could consider a different challenge perhaps, or you might be in ongoing discussions with the company or doing ongoing research, and new information is developing all the time, and given this new information, you might want to change the challenges that you thought were applicable in part 1 but are now not so applicable in part 2. So strategy is something that's dynamic, and you need to be reactive as well. So we enable you to change those challenges with no penalty. The second task you have is an infographic that describes the core essence of your report in 1 page. And we have an A2 minimum here, so you can fit a lot of information into an A2 sized piece of paper. For some examples of infographics, I invite you to go to Google and just type in examples of infographics, and that'll give you a really large selection of where we're going with this. Now, this is a very important part of your deliverables, because while the report tests your ability to communicate in the traditional written sense, task 2, this infographic, really challenges you to get that information and distill it down to the core essence of what you're trying to say, or a few key facts that are the most important to delivering your message of what strategy the business should do, and the tactics that you think that they should execute. And it really just summarizes everything into a way that is visually very attention grabbing, and also helps us to find the engagement and the passion that hopefully you had dealing with your business client. Here are some examples of infographics that I just did by typing in infographic examples on Google. So you see there's a whole range of different ways of conveying information in a way that is a little bit more engaging than a traditional report, and is also very different from a traditional presentation. So by implementing this infographic as one of your key deliverables or one of your tasks, we're really hoping to take into account that different people have different strengths within your group, and also the importance of being able to convey information and strategy in different formats, whether it be report, presentation, or in this visual format. So the last task for part 2 is that group presentation. Now, even though it's a presentation given with your group, it is graded individually. So you get 20% of your mark based on your individual contribution to this group presentation. So each person gets 2 minutes to basically talk about some component of the group project that they contributed to. And we'll go through the marking rubric of how that individual presentation will be marked. In terms of teams that are, all local students, they can all show up. We expect you all to turn up on the day in a room that will be booked via Doodle poll at some point. For those teams that are completely remote, we expect you to upload a video link or video file that we can click on to watch each member of your team presenting for approximately 2 minutes. And for those teams that are a blend of local and remote, then we would recommend that the remote students supply the video to the team prior to the presentation so that they can display it during the presentation slot. You could try and zoom in. That is a little bit riskier though, due to potential technical issues and internet bandwidth connection sort of issues that might happen on the day. In terms of the format of the group presentation, normally groups use a PowerPoint presentation. However, in saying that, that is not 100% necessary. If you are all in the same room at the same time, you could simply present to the poster that was covered in task 2. So we've had that happen in the past as well, where you've done this beautiful A2 sized poster infographic. You could just simply step up next to it and present your 2 minutes based on that, right? So we try not to dictate too much of how you present your part 2 assignment to us, but we just want you to consider some things, particularly if your team is made up of students that are both remote and local. Right, so half this group project is about the group content and how that group content is organized. So you'll notice that of the 50 points that part 2 is worth, so it's 100 points altogether, 20% of that, or half of that, is this group content, which consists of the report and the poster, and then the other 50 points, or the other 20%, is the individual presentation that I'll cover in the next slide. But for this this part of it, which is the group content that the entire group has hopefully worked together to provide, we look at the content, and I explain later on what that means. Essentially, it is the what you are saying to us. So what are you telling us in part 2? This is followed by the organization of what you're saying. So how you present that material to us in the written form in terms of the report, and also in the visual form in terms of the poster, right? So we want not only to pay attention to what you're saying, the recommendations, the tactics, the return on investment, etc., but also how you're presenting that. Okay, so that because they say what you say is important, but how you say it is also equally important. And you can have a lot of great ideas, but if you don't present them the right way in a logical format that's easy to follow for the audience, then you're going to lose a lot of that value, right? And in the very last slide, we will talk about what we actually mean by content. So it's explained here in this fine print, but we'll go into each one of those 5 points before this video set is finished. One thing I mentioned at the beginning of the class, the beautiful thing about this capstone project is that throughout your entire university degree, you've been taught how to communicate upwards. So you've been essentially marked and graded on your ability to tell us how much you know, to use the jargon properly, use specialist language, and essentially prove that you've done a lot of work and thinking about the discipline that you're majoring in. This capstone project now, which finishes off your marketing major, is an exercise in communicating downwards. So this means that you're telling us important stuff, but at a level where you're assuming the person you're communicating with may not know as much about the business and the sector as you do. And so we go into the real world and you're a marketing manager or a consultant or a business specialist, that will form a very large part of your career and your daily work, is communicating with a diverse range of people in a way that they can understand what you are saying. So think about that when you're putting together the report, the infographic, and of course the presentation. So as mentioned earlier, 20% of this course is based on your individual presentation during the group presentation of part 2 of your assignment. right? So you've got the report, which is done as a group, you've got the poster, which is done as a group, and now you'll be showing up as a group or presenting individually for approximately 2 minutes each on some aspect of the group assignment that you contributed to. As you can see on the rubric here, some of that 20% is based on your actual presentation and communication skills. So those of you that are presenting remotely, please provide a video of your presentation, not just an audio file, because we need to be able to grade you based on your presentation ability, as in when we see you as a person presenting. For those of you that are in person, this is less of an issue, obviously, because you're turning up. You'll notice there are things like being audible, trying to get your pronunciation as clear and articulate as possible. We've made some resources in terms of how to present available under modules, so have a look at those. It's put together by one of our postgrad students, Helen Jarrett. She, for those of you that don't know, she's actually an opera singer, so she's done a lot of voice work, a lot of speaking and singing, publicly. So she has a lot of talent in that department, and we thought it would be really useful to basically hear from someone really experienced at presentations. So have a look at those. There's also obviously the content aspect of your individual presentation. So this is, how, I guess, confident and how competent you are with the content that you're actually presenting about. Do we get the impression that you actually did that work, or are you just presenting something that the rest of the group put together and has just handed over to you, right? Then there's other aspects or components of presentation, such as eye contact, if you're in the room with us, obviously, and that you're not reading from cue cards, that sort of stuff. Timing is important because, there's a lot of groups, but, in real life, there are time limits, right? And so when you have a presentation time limit of 10 minutes for a group of 5 or 12 minutes for a group of 6, then you need to keep to that time zone, and each person should not exceed the 2 minutes that they have. And finally, there's a certain level of enthusiasm and engagement that we expect from people when they're presenting. Now, marketers are known for their ability to present, in any organization. And so given that you're doing this paper probably as part of a marketing major, we would want to be able to say that graduates leaving the University of Auckland Business School can present and can engage the audience when they have to present. So that's basically the rubric for the 20%. A lot of it is, as you can see, the actual presentation, so the process of presenting, whereas some component still looks at that content that you're presenting. So you would have recalled in the marketing rubric, we mentioned this thing called content. And also in the individual presentation, part of that will also be graded on the content that you delivered during your individual presentation. What do we mean by content? So this is outlined in the first marketing rubric. First of all, the content involves restating those 3 challenges. Remember, between part 1 and part 2, those challenges may change for some groups. So as the graders, we need to know exactly what your 3 most current challenges are to be addressed in part 2. The second thing is to obviously outline what you're recommending to address those challenges. Now, there's no set number of recommendations or solutions, right? Just because you have 3 challenges does not mean you need 3 solutions, right? It could be that you have 1 solution that solves everything, or it could be that you need, 2 solutions for the first problem and then 1 solution each for the second 2 challenges, right? So you could have any number of solutions. So there's no single way to approach this project because every case is unique. What we're really looking for, though, regardless of the number of solutions you're proposing, is why we should be convinced by your thinking. Okay, so why do we think that your recommendations will actually help solve the problems or the challenges that you've just outlined? So how will they be implemented is the other part of content. And more importantly also, well, equally importantly, is how much it will cost. Because remember, we're operating strategically within a context of limited resources, right? So we kind of need to know how much your solutions are going to cost the company and what they hope to get back in return, so that return on investment. And I've made another video presentation available looking at return on investment and what are some ways you might be able to figure that out. Now, that presentation was designed mainly for the advertising and promotions paper. However, many of the concepts covered there are applicable to strategic marketing as well. What you're basically trying to do is figure out how much it costs to implement what you're suggesting and how much they're going to get back for doing what you're telling them to do. Because if it costs more for them to implement your solutions, then they're going to get back for it, then the obvious decision is to not do what you're recommending. So we're asking a question about how much either they will make or how much they will save by doing what you're asking them to do.